Ever seen an army win without a massive assault? They seal every road, letting hunger do the fighting instead of swords and spears. When the last grain of sand falls, the city gate doesn't explode, it just opens. Keep watching, because what you're about to hear isn't just about battles. It's about how an empire turned fear into the very infrastructure of war. They called him Genghis Khan, the great Khan of the steppe, but the most terrifying thing wasn't the arrow in flight, it was how he organized sheer desperation into a plan. According to medieval records, like those of Ad-Malik Juvayni in Persia, the Rus Chronicles, and several Chinese sources, Mongol warfare wasn't just about charging in and slashing. It was the mathematics of hunger, the technology of submission, and a discipline so total that rumors died before soldiers did. A starvation siege wasn't a new invention, but the level of calculation was extraordinary. During the Khwarezmian campaign, 1219-1221, cities like Nishapur, Merv, and Urgench were sealed like iron boxes. Supply lines were cut, markets controlled, and watchtowers sprang up like teeth in a comb around the walls. How they turned time into a weapon was even colder than the physical blockade itself. Some sources say engineers would measure the population, the stockpiles, and the livestock, estimating the exact breaking point the day famine would flip to surrender. No need to smash the walls, just wait for the last market day to fall silent. Inside, people began to boil shoe leather, cook grass, and then quietly disappear from the census. When bread turns to dust, oaths of loyalty also turn to wind, Juvayni wrote of Merv, as grimly as a coroner's report. Poisoning wells is mentioned in some accounts, though its widespread use is debated. What's certain is that the perimeter was total, lifelines were choked, and the spiritual collapse was as predictable as a cold equation. Do you see how a war without gunfire can be more terrifying? Hold that thought. It explains why so many cities surrendered before a single blade was ever drawn. But when the gates opened, the story wasn't over. An empire doesn't just take land, it takes people. After Bukhara, 1220, the sorting of people was recorded in many sources. Men were herded separately, women and children separately. Artisans were marked, the healthy were counted like units of labor. This wasn't for sadistic pleasure. It was to build a living database for a new empire. Smiths, carpenters, scribes, horse breeders. And in that crowd were the women often turned into spoils of war, enslaved, or forced into political marriages. Persian, Chinese, and Russian sources describe them being sorted by age, origin, and status. The point isn't the crude judgment of their appearance, but the mechanism of power. Seizing an enemy's women meant erasing his political bloodline, breaking alliances, and sending a signal: we decide the future of your families. The line between survival and being sold, between an old identity and a new name, was as thin as a rope. The worst pain was the invisibility. Very few of their names survived in history. But if this was the price for the defeated, the price for those who resisted was even more horrific. Another dark chapter of Mongol warfare, turning prisoners into human shields. At Gurganj, Urgench, 1221, as resistance stiffened, some records say captives were forced to the front lines, placed between the catapults, siege ladders, and the enemy walls. Militarily, it was a way to drain the enemy's arrows, disrupt their formations, and shorten the assault. Psychologically, it was a knife to the defender's conscience. To fire meant killing the very people they knew. Some sources describe prisoners being tied together to prevent escape, forced to fill moats, push ladders, and haul siege engines, all under a rain of arrows. Chilling? Absolutely. But it was part of the equation of deterrence. Surrender early, you live. Resist, and your own people become the shields. This wasn't always applied as an iron law, but its appearance in historical accounts shows its role as a convergent psychological weapon, and it connects directly to the total philosophy. War is everyone's business in the most brutal sense. If the human shield was how they broke the collective will, symbolic executions were how they attacked the symbols themselves. After the Battle of the Khalkha River, 1223, Rus chronicles and some Persian sources recount how the captured Rus princes were laid face down, and a large wooden platform was built on top of them as a banquet table. The Mongol generals ate, drank, and danced, while those below slowly suffocated to death. Why no bloodshed? In some steppe traditions, there was a taboo against spilling noble blood, and this method both killed and honored. That taboo, though the universality of this custom is still debated. But the effect was clear. It was theater of power. The feast was the death sentence. It wasn't just killing people, it was killing their honor, their reputation, and the very idea that they were still someone after defeat. Just imagine the clinking cups, the laughter, the sound of dancing on that platform, that cheerful noise mingling with the fading breaths of the defeated below. That was a lesson spoken through action. From now on, the feast is ours. Your very breath is just the floor. But war isn't just about external enemies. A great empire must also deal with threats from within. An empire is like a body with an immune system. Treason is a cancer. The punishment of being tied behind a horse and dragged to death appears in many records for dealing with traitors, spies, or governors who switched sides and then switched back. It was public, decisive, and meant to show anyone with lingering doubts that the new order did not negotiate on loyalty. If anyone thought this was just a burst of rage, look how it fits the spirit of discipline, often linked to the yasa, a code of laws attributed to Genghis Khan, though its specific details are still debated by academics. Still, one thing is certain: internal deterrence was the final nail in the coffin of instability. A highly mobile empire needed commands to travel faster than rumors. Public punishment was how you strangled a rumor at birth. Do you see the common denominator? Starvation siege hits the stomach. Human shields hits the conscience. The execution feast hits the symbol. Dragging hits loyalty. 4 arrows aimed at 4 different organs of a society. And there was a 5th arrow, less bloody but just as terrifying: the speed of information. The horse relay system, Di-Yam, allowed orders to travel faster than the seasons changed. News of one city's annihilation could reach the next city before the Mongol vanguard even appeared, creating a domino effect. The legend arrived one day before the army, and by the time the cavalry appeared, fear had already set the table. Now, let's go back to the battlefield, where psychological warfare becomes the rope that pulls open the city gate. When scouts rode past the fields, they weren't just counting tents and granaries. They were listening to what the people whispered. Urgench is ashes. Bukhara opened its gates. At Kalka, the princes became a table. Those short sentences could break a city's back faster than a catapult. Imagine you're the 3rd guard on the wall. Your stomach is empty, your hands are shaking, your child is sick at home, and the story of the feast on men's backs is being whispered behind you. Do you fight, or do you fold? But this war machine wasn't just run by one man. At Nishapur in 1221, many sources place Genghis Khan's son, Tolui, in direct command, not always the great Khan himself. This is key. It shows the machine of conquest could run without its master being present, like a decentralized algorithm. The story is no longer just individual genius, it's a system that knew how to replicate brutal acts into a modular process. But if you only list the atrocities, you miss half the answer. Why did these methods work? Because they were tied to logistics. Besiege a city to spill less of your own troops' blood, saving strength for the next campaign. Turn residents into forced labor to build bridges, fix roads, and feed horses instead of letting them become rebels behind your lines. Use human shields to reduce your own casualties. Use symbolic executions to send a press release in images for hundreds of miles when there was no press. And use internal deterrence to lower the cost of surveillance, allowing your armies to rocket across new borders without being chained by suspicion. Everything was calculated on a cost-benefit analysis. The weapons here were human emotions, and the Mongols learned which keys to press. However, serious scholarship reminds us to be wary of absolute statements. Not every city was starved into cannibalism. Not every campaign used human shields. Not every execution was bloodless. And not everything was written into a formal, textual Yasa law. Medieval sources are colored by their own era, exaggerating to teach a moral lesson, embellishing to legitimize, erasing to protect the author. So, the accounts from Juvayni, the Rus Chronicles, Chinese histories, They should be read like different corners of a dark room. Pieced together, we get a shape. And that's why, when telling the story, we frame these scenes carefully. This is according to Source X. Its prevalence is debated, but the pattern of deterrence, logistics, and discipline is the clear through line. Some modern commentators often ask, was this all just meaningless cruelty? Let's peel back the layers. Cruel? Yes. Meaningless? No. It had a very specific meaning, cutting the cost of war by pushing the burden onto the enemy. When the enemy opens the gates for you, you save ammunition, you save time, and you save the lives of your own soldiers. When your enemy fears your reputation more than your spear, you've already won before you've even marched. But everything comes at a price. When war turns people into materials, the victims' memories are crushed between the axe and the wheel of history. The traces left behind are cold, hard lines. The men were separated, the women were distributed, the children were herded, the artisans were spared. We read them, and the words feel like nails in a coffin. Cold, blunt, final. We don't know their names, only the function they were forced to serve. That very anonymity is the greatest tragedy. It explains why, 700 years later, we still feel a knot in our throats when we hear these stories. So, in the end, how did these methods, dragging, feasting, shielding, help turn nomads into rulers of a continent? The answer lies at the intersection of fear and logistics. Fear made the gates lock themselves from the inside, while logistics ensured the war machine never sputtered. When those two forces shook hands, the map of Eurasia changed color at a speed that left history breathless. And at the center of that storm was a simple, brutal idea. Don't just attack their muscles, attack their nervous system. We don't end here to close the book on history, but to open a vital question for today. In an age where an image travels faster than the truth, where a rumor moves quicker than a tank, the lessons from the 13th century are still dangerous. Whoever controls the imagination controls the city gate. History doesn't ask for your approval. It demands you see yourself in its mirror. If you want more videos like this, dissecting the psychological weapons of history, hit subscribe, ring the bell, share this with a history-loving friend, and leave a comment. Which of these tactics do you find the most terrifying? Because it's still effective in the world today. We'll meet in the comments where your answer might just be the hook for the next video.